Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax.
A couple of days had passed since I'd driven down to visit some old friends in Austin. Living in Louisiana meant the journey back home would take me most of the day, winding through those endless Texas highways. On that final morning in the city, something unexpected happened that would change everything about my trip home. My phone buzzed with a notification from an old high school friend named Tom, someone I hadn't properly spoken to in years, though we still followed each other's lives through social media. He'd seen my story and asked when I was heading out, and when I mentioned I was leaving that very day, he told me something that seemed like perfect timing. He lived about an hour outside Austin, right along the route I'd be taking back to Louisiana. The thought of seeing Tom after all these years felt right somehow, like the universe was giving us a chance to reconnect. When he suggested I stop by his place for a visit, something in me immediately said yes, even though a smaller voice wondered if this was really a good idea. I typed his address into my GPS and watched it calculate about 90 minutes of driving time, taking me through parts of Texas I'd never seen before. Our friendship had been one of those intense high school bonds that simply dissolved after graduation, not from any conflict but from life pulling us in different directions. We kept tabs on each other through occasional likes and comments, but this would be our first real conversation in probably 5 or 6 years. The drive to his place took me through increasingly rural roads, each turn taking me further from civilization. When I finally pulled into his driveway, the first thing that struck me was how the house seemed frozen in time. The structure wasn't falling apart or neglected, but it had this weathered quality that made it feel like it belonged to another era entirely. The wooden boards of the porch groaned under my weight as I walked to the front door, each step announcing my arrival. When Tom opened that door, I was hit with this wave of smells that transported me somewhere else entirely. Old wood mixed with something earthier, like walking into a cabin that had been closed up for a season. But Tom himself was exactly as I remembered him, maybe a little older around the eyes but with that same genuine warmth. His hug was strong and real, pulling me inside like no time had passed at all. Some friendships are like that, immune to the passage of years, picking up right where they left off. The interior of his house matched the outside perfectly, everything seemingly untouched since the 70s or 80s. The furniture had that lived-in quality that comes from decades of use, and the hardwood floors announced every movement with small creaks and groans. There was something oddly charming about it though, authentically Texan in a way that felt honest rather than manufactured. We settled into his living room with glasses of whiskey even though it was barely 5 in the evening. The conversation flowed as easily as the drinks, stories from our separate lives filling the space between us. That first glass turned into a second almost without me noticing, then a third, and before I had any real sense of time passing, I realized I was genuinely drunk. The alcohol created this warm bubble around us, making the room feel simultaneously more intimate and somehow oppressive. Hours dissolved into each other, the way they do when you're catching up with someone who knew you before you became who you are now. We were having such an incredible time that I barely registered how dark it had gotten outside. Eventually, inevitably, Tom asked the question I should have seen coming from the moment I agreed to visit. His voice was casual but concerned as he pointed out the obvious. I had a long journey ahead and was in absolutely no condition to be behind the wheel. Why didn't I just crash there for the night and head out fresh in the morning? I hesitated, something in my gut giving me pause, but logic won out because he was absolutely right about my condition. When I accepted and asked about taking the couch we were sitting on, he waved that away immediately. He had a proper guest room, he said, nothing special but definitely more comfortable than sleeping on a couch. After we demolished some Chinese takeout that we'd ordered, both of us now properly drunk and full, Tom led me down a narrow hallway toward the spare bedroom. My intoxicated state meant I wasn't really taking in details, but I remembered distinctly how the air in that room felt different from the rest of the house, thicker somehow, like it had been sealed off for a long time. The exhaustion hit me all at once, alcohol and the long day finally catching up, and I basically collapsed onto the bed without even properly looking around the room. Deep in the night, something pulled me from that heavy, drunken sleep. My mouth felt like sandpaper, my head was spinning even lying down, and the room was almost completely dark except for thin strips of moonlight filtering through old blinds. As my eyes started to adjust to the darkness, that's when I noticed it. In the far corner of the room, hanging on what must have been the closet door, was something that made my blood turn cold. At first glance, my brain tried to rationalize it as a long black coat hanging on a hook or rack. But the longer I stared, the more wrong it seemed. The shape had these broad shoulders, and the way it hung there looked less like clothing and more like the silhouette of a person standing perfectly still. My heart started hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I tried to remember if I'd seen anything there when I'd stumbled into the room earlier, but the alcohol had made everything fuzzy. Maybe it had been there all along and I just hadn't noticed in my drunken state. I forced myself to roll over, facing away from it, telling myself over and over that it was just a coat, nothing more than fabric in my imagination. But I couldn't help myself. I had to look again. When I turned back, it was still there, exactly the same, unmoving in that corner. I squeezed my eyes shut as tight as I could, taking deep breaths, forcing myself to go back to sleep through sheer willpower. The next time consciousness found me, it wasn't gentle. It was a sound that yanked me awake. A slow, deliberate creaking, like someone taking careful steps across old floorboards, trying not to be heard but betrayed by the age of the house. My eyes snapped open to find the room lighter now, dawn seeping through those same blinds. I turned my head toward that corner and my stomach dropped through the floor. The coat, or whatever it had been, was gone. Just an empty closet door where that dark shape had been standing watch all night. I shot up so fast the room spun, my body fighting between leftover alcohol and pure adrenaline. I scanned every corner of the room, my heart threatening to break through my ribs. Nothing. Just an empty room and that open closet door. I practically ran to Tom's room, shaking him awake with probably more force than necessary. It took serious effort to rouse him from his alcohol-induced sleep, but finally his confused eyes focused on me. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, telling him about the coat, the figure, whatever it had been, hanging in that room. He squinted at me like I was speaking another language, genuinely confused by my panic. When I explained about the black coat that looked like a person on the closet door, his confusion only deepened. He said he didn't own anything like that, didn't even have a coat rack in that room. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for him to admit this was some elaborate prank. But his expression remained completely serious, maybe even a little concerned about my mental state. I insisted he come look, and though he sighed like I was being ridiculous, he followed me back to that room. I pointed to the exact spot where it had been, explaining how I'd woken up and seen it there, then woken again to find it gone. Tom stood there scratching his head, asking if I was sure I hadn't just been dreaming, but I knew what I'd experienced. This wasn't some alcohol-induced hallucination. We stood in that room together, both of us feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on us. Finally, Tom suggested we search the house just to be sure, just to put our minds at ease. We went through every room, checking closets, looking behind doors, even checking the locks on all the windows and doors. Nothing. No signs anyone had been inside, no mysterious coats hanging anywhere, nothing that could explain what I'd seen. Tom tried to convince me that maybe I'd been in some kind of half-dream state, that the alcohol and strange environment had played tricks on my mind. Part of me wanted desperately to believe that explanation because the alternative was too unsettling to consider. As soon as the sun was properly up, I gathered my things, said my goodbyes, and got back on the road. I felt guilty leaving Tom alone in that house, but I needed to get away from that place. The entire drive back to Louisiana, my mind kept returning to that moment. Waking up to see that dark figure watching me from the corner, then finding it gone. Maybe Tom had played some twisted joke on me, but he's never admitted to anything in all the years since, which makes me doubt that theory. Or maybe, just maybe, there really had been someone in that house that night, someone who stood in that corner watching me sleep, and who decided to slip away before the morning light could reveal them. There are certain memories from when you're young that never leave you, moments that embed themselves so deeply that even decades later, they surface in your mind as fresh as the day they happened. I'm 34 now, but I still remember every detail of what happened when I was 15, during what was supposed to be an ordinary summer in suburban Michigan. My parents had gone away for their anniversary weekend, leaving me and my younger sister Emma home alone for the first time. Emma was 13 then, and we thought we were so mature, so ready to handle a couple of nights without supervision. Looking back now with my own kids, I can't believe my parents thought that was a good idea, but it was a different time back then. That first night went exactly how you'd expect with two teenagers left alone. We ordered pizza with my dad's emergency money, watched horror movies we weren't usually allowed to see, and stayed up until 3 in the morning feeling like we owned the world. Emma fell asleep on the couch during the last movie, and I remember covering her with a blanket, feeling oddly protective and grown up in that moment. The house felt different without our parents there, larger somehow, like the rooms had expanded to fill the space their absence created. Every normal sound seemed amplified in the darkness as I made my way upstairs to my bedroom. The air conditioner kicking on sounded like someone sighing, the ice maker in the kitchen like footsteps on the floor below. I'd been asleep for maybe 2 hours when something woke me up, though I couldn't immediately identify what had pulled me from my dreams. My room was exactly as I'd left it, door slightly open to let the hallway light in, just the way I'd slept since I was little. But something felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite place, like the air pressure had changed or the temperature had dropped just enough to notice. Then I heard it, so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. Music, barely audible, drifting up from somewhere downstairs. Not the TV, which I was certain I'd turned off, but actual music like someone was playing a radio at the lowest possible volume. My first thought was that Emma had woken up and turned something on, but the music had this strange quality to it, old-fashioned and static-filled, like it was coming through an AM radio from the 50s. I lay there for what felt like forever but was probably only a minute or two, just listening, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The rational part of my teenage brain kept insisting there was a logical explanation, while another part, a deeper instinctive part, was screaming at me that something was very wrong. When I finally worked up the courage to get out of bed, my feet felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. Every step toward my bedroom door took enormous effort, like walking through water. The hallway stretched out before me, longer than it should have been, the stairs at the end seeming miles away. The music grew slightly clearer as I reached the top of the stairs, and I could make out that it was some old song, the kind my grandmother used to listen to, all crooning vocals and orchestral swells. But underneath the music was something else, a sound that made my skin crawl. It was humming, someone humming along to the tune, and it was coming from our living room. I crept down those stairs slower than I'd ever moved in my life, avoiding every creaky spot I'd memorized from years of sneaking down for late-night snacks. About halfway down, I could see into the living room through the banister rails, and what I saw there still visits me in nightmares sometimes. Emma was still on the couch where I'd left her, still covered with the blanket, but she wasn't alone. Sitting in my father's recliner, the one nobody else was ever allowed to use, was a woman I'd never seen before. She was maybe in her 60s, wearing what looked like a house dress from another era, and she was knitting something while humming along to that ghostly music that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The woman looked completely at ease, like she'd been sitting in our living room for years, like she belonged there more than we did. She would occasionally look over at Emma sleeping on the couch with this expression that I can only describe as maternal satisfaction, the way a grandmother might look at a grandchild she was babysitting. My mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Maybe it was a relative I didn't recognize, maybe my parents had arranged for someone to check on us, maybe I was still dreaming. But deep down, in that primal part of your brain that recognizes danger, I knew this woman wasn't supposed to be here. I must have made some sound, maybe a sharp intake of breath or a slight movement that caught her attention, because suddenly her head snapped up and she was looking directly at me through the banister rails. Her face changed in that instant from grandmotherly warmth to something else entirely, something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. She smiled at me, but it was wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth, and she put a finger to her lips in a shushing motion. Then she stood up from the chair with a fluid grace that didn't match her apparent age, never breaking eye contact with me. The knitting disappeared somewhere into the folds of her dress, and she began walking toward the stairs, toward me, still with that terrible smile stretching her face. I don't remember making the decision to run, my body just took over. I sprinted back up those stairs faster than I'd ever moved before, slammed my bedroom door, and locked it with shaking fingers. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but my hands were trembling so badly I could barely unlock it. That's when I heard her on the stairs, her footsteps slow and measured, unhurried like she had all the time in the world. She stopped right outside my door and I could see her shadow in the gap underneath. She stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then I heard her voice, sweet and soft like she was talking to a small child. She said my name, my full name including my middle name that hardly anyone knew, and asked me to open the door, said she just wanted to talk, said she'd been waiting so long to meet me. I dialed 911 with my phone on silent, whispering to the operator about an intruder in our house. They said they were sending units immediately, told me to stay locked in my room, stay on the line. The woman outside my door kept talking in that sing-song voice, telling me stories about my family, things she couldn't possibly know, details about my grandparents who died before I was born, about the house's history, about the people who'd lived here before us. Then, as suddenly as she'd appeared, I heard her footsteps moving away from my door, back down the stairs. The music that had been playing cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow worse than the sound had been. I stayed on the phone with the 911 operator, terrified to move, terrified to make any sound that might bring her back. When the police arrived, they found the front door wide open, swaying slightly in the night breeze. Emma was still asleep on the couch, completely unaware that anything had happened. There was no sign of the woman, no evidence she'd ever been there except for one thing that made the officers exchange concerned looks. In my father's chair, where she'd been sitting, was a half-finished knitting project. The needle still stuck through the yarn like she'd just set it down for a moment and planned to return. The pattern was for a child's sweater, the exact size Emma would wear, in her favorite color that she'd only decided on a week before. The police searched the neighborhood, questioned all the neighbors, but no one had seen anything. They took the knitting as evidence, but nothing ever came of it. My parents came home immediately, and we never spent another night alone in that house. Emma, thankfully, slept through the entire thing and had no memory of it, which I've always been grateful for. We moved less than a year later, my parents claiming it was for my dad's work, but I knew the truth. They were as unsettled as I was, especially after the detective told them something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. The yarn that woman had been using was discontinued in the 80s, and when they tested it, they found it was covered in dust like it had been sitting somewhere for decades, untouched until that night. I'm an adult now with teenagers of my own, and I've never once left them alone overnight. My husband thinks I'm overprotective, but he doesn't understand, didn't experience what I did. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I still think I can hear that old music drifting up from nowhere, and I check the locks one more time before going to bed, wondering if somewhere out there, that woman is still knitting, still waiting, still wanting to finish whatever she started that night in our living room. The conference in Denver had wrapped up earlier than expected, giving me an extra day before my flight back to Florida. 3 days of presentations and networking had left me exhausted but satisfied, especially after landing that partnership deal I'd been working toward for months. Sitting in my hotel room that final morning, scrolling through my phone while deciding whether to explore the city or just relax, I noticed a familiar name pop up in my Facebook messages. Marcus had seen my posts about being in Denver for work and reached out with perfect timing. We'd been close friends back in college, the kind of friendship forged through late-night study sessions and shared struggles through engineering courses. After graduation, life had pulled us in different directions, him to Colorado and me to Florida, and somehow 7 years had slipped by with nothing but occasional birthday wishes and holiday greetings between us. His message was simple but warm, asking if I had any free time before heading home. When I mentioned my flight wasn't until the following evening, he immediately suggested I come visit him in the mountain town where he lived now, about 2 hours outside Denver. He said it would be criminal for me to leave Colorado without seeing the real mountains, not just the city skyline, and besides, we had years of catching up to do. Something about the spontaneity of it appealed to me after 3 days of rigid conference schedules. I'd been planning to spend the day doing nothing special, maybe visiting a museum or finding a good restaurant, but reconnecting with Marcus sounded infinitely better. I messaged him back saying I'd rent a car and drive up, and he responded with his address and increasingly enthusiastic messages about how great it would be to catch up properly. The drive from Denver into the mountains was spectacular in a way that made me understand why Marcus had chosen to settle here after college. The landscape transformed gradually as I climbed in elevation, urban sprawl giving way to pine forests and dramatic rock formations. My rental car's GPS led me through winding mountain roads that seemed to get narrower with each turn, taking me deeper into what felt like another world entirely from the conference rooms I'd been inhabiting. Marcus lived in one of those small mountain communities that probably had a population of a few hundred at most, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and the nearest grocery store was a 30-minute drive. His house sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by towering pines that made it feel completely isolated from civilization. It was a modest cabin-style home that looked like it had been built decades ago, with weathered wood siding that had taken on a silver-gray patina from years of mountain weather. When I pulled into his driveway, gravel crunching under the tires, Marcus was already stepping out onto his front porch with a huge grin on his face. He looked different from college, his face more weathered, a full beard now covering his jaw, but his eyes held the same friendly warmth I remembered. The hug he gave me was genuine and strong, the kind that made the 7 years of absence seem insignificant. The interior of his house perfectly matched its mountain setting, all exposed wooden beams and rustic furniture that looked handmade. There was a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall of the living room, and the whole place smelled of pine and wood smoke in a way that immediately made me feel cozy and removed from my regular life. Marcus gave me the quick tour, pointing out various projects he'd completed since buying the place, his pride in the home evident in every detail he shared. We settled into his living room with local craft beers he'd picked up specially for my visit, sinking into worn leather furniture that had clearly seen years of use. The conversation started with the safe topics like work and mutual friends from college, but as the afternoon wore on and the beers kept coming, we delved deeper into real-life stuff, relationships that had failed, career disappointments, family struggles, all the things you don't put in Facebook posts. The sun started setting earlier than I expected, probably around 6 o'clock, painting the mountains outside his windows in shades of orange and purple that looked almost artificial in their beauty. By that point, we'd moved from beer to whiskey, Marcus producing a bottle of something local and expensive that he'd been saving for a special occasion. The alcohol combined with the altitude, which I wasn't used to coming from sea-level Florida, hit me harder than anticipated. Time became fluid in that way it does when you're genuinely enjoying yourself, hours passing without notice. We must have covered every significant event from the past 7 years, laughing about memories I'd forgotten, filling in the gaps of our separate lives. Marcus had always been a great storyteller, and his tales of adjusting to mountain life, dealing with wildlife, and learning to live with real isolation were fascinating to someone who'd spent their entire adult life in cities. It must have been close to midnight when the room started spinning just enough to make me realize I was genuinely drunk, not just buzzed but properly intoxicated in a way I hadn't been since my 20s. Marcus noticed me swaying slightly when I stood up to use the bathroom and laughed, saying the altitude and whiskey combination was notorious for catching flatlanders off guard. When I came back from the bathroom, walking more carefully than normal, Marcus was already pulling blankets from a closet. He said there was no way he was letting me drive back to Denver in my condition, especially on mountain roads at night. I started to protest, mentioning my hotel room already paid for, my flight the next day, but he waved all of that away. He'd drive me back to Denver himself in the morning, he promised, plenty of time to catch my flight. The relief I felt at not having to navigate those dark mountain roads was immediate and overwhelming. I asked about crashing on the couch, which looked comfortable enough, but Marcus shook his head. He had a guest room, he said, though he apologized in advance for its condition, saying he rarely had visitors and used it mostly for storage. Any bed sounded better than a couch at that point, so I gratefully accepted. He led me down a narrow hallway, the wooden floors creaking under our unsteady steps. The guest room was at the back of the house, and when he opened the door, I was hit with the smell of a space that hadn't been aired out in months. It was small, dominated by a double bed with what looked like handmade quilts, and boxes were stacked against one wall. Marcus apologized again for the clutter, grabbed a few boxes to clear a path to the bed, and wished me good night with another of those genuine smiles. I barely registered the details of the room in my intoxicated state, focused mainly on not stumbling as I made my way to the bed. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, sinking just enough under my weight, and the quilts smelled faintly of cedar and age. I remember thinking I should set an alarm, remember worrying briefly about my rental car, my flight, logistics that seemed impossibly complex in my current state, but sleep pulled me under before I could act on any of those thoughts. The first time I woke, it was to complete darkness and a throat so dry it felt like I'd been eating sand. The room was pitch black in a way you never experience in cities, no ambient light from street lamps or neighboring buildings, just absolute darkness that made me question whether my eyes were open or closed. The altitude wasn't helping either, making each breath feel slightly insufficient, like I couldn't quite get enough oxygen. As I lay there trying to orient myself, remembering where I was, why I was there, my eyes gradually began to adjust to the darkness. There must have been some moonlight filtering through the window because shapes slowly started to emerge from the blackness. The dresser against one wall, the stack of boxes Marcus hadn't moved, and in the corner by what I assumed was a closet, something tall and dark that my brain couldn't quite categorize. At first, I thought it was more boxes, maybe something covered with a sheet or tarp. But the longer I stared, the more the shape bothered me on some fundamental level. It was too tall, too narrow, and there was something about the way it seemed to lean slightly forward that made it look less like stored items and more like a person standing very still in the corner, watching me. My rational mind, even drunk and disoriented, knew that was ridiculous. It was just the unfamiliar room playing tricks on me, shadows creating patterns that weren't there. I closed my eyes, telling myself to go back to sleep, that I'd laugh about this paranoid moment in the morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, that crawling sensation on your skin when you know someone's watching you. I opened my eyes again and the shape was still there, unchanged, unmoving. The more I looked at it, the more details seemed to emerge. What might have been shoulders at the top, a narrowing that could be a waist, the way it seemed to stand with a slight forward lean like someone trying to see better in the dark. My heart started racing despite my attempts to stay calm, to think logically about what I was seeing. I reached for my phone on the nightstand thinking I could use its flashlight to prove to myself it was nothing, but in my drunken fumbling, I knocked it to the floor where it disappeared under the bed. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room, and I held my breath, watching that shape in the corner for any sign of movement, any indication it had heard me. Nothing happened. The shape remained still and gradually my breathing returned to normal. This was stupid, I told myself. I was a grown adult getting scared of shadows in an unfamiliar room. I forced myself to roll over, facing the wall instead of the corner, and squeezed my eyes shut with determination. Eventually, through sheer exhaustion and the lingering effects of alcohol, I drifted back to sleep. The second time I woke, dim gray light was filtering through the window, the first hints of dawn in the mountains. My head was pounding with the beginning of what promised to be a spectacular hangover, and my mouth still felt like a desert. I rolled over slowly, carefully, trying not to aggravate my headache, and immediately looked toward the corner. The corner was empty. Just bare walls meeting at an angle, no boxes, no coat rack, no tall shapes that looked like people. Nothing that could explain what I'd been staring at for who knows how long in the middle of the night. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by confusion. I sat up, ignoring the way it made my head spin, and scanned the room more carefully. Everything else was exactly as I remembered it. The boxes against the wall, the dresser, everything except whatever had been standing in that corner. I could see now that there was a closet door there, slightly ajar, and tried to convince myself that's all I'd been looking at, just a partially open door creating weird shadows. But I knew the shape I'd seen hadn't been flat like a door. It had depth, dimension, presence in a way a door couldn't mimic. I got up, my legs unsteady from lingering alcohol and dehydration, and made my way to Marcus's room. His door was open and I could hear him snoring inside. It took several attempts to wake him, shaking his shoulder increasingly hard until his eyes finally fluttered open, confused and irritated at being woken so early. When I told him about what I'd seen or thought I'd seen, his expression went through several changes. First confusion, then something that looked almost like recognition before settling on concern. He sat up, rubbing his face, and asked me to describe exactly what I'd witnessed. When I mentioned the tall shape in the corner, the way it had looked like a person standing there, he was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he asked if I was sure I hadn't been dreaming. The altitude, the alcohol, the unfamiliar environment, all of it could cause vivid dreams or hallucinations. I wanted to agree with him, wanted that simple explanation to be true, but I knew the difference between dreams and reality even drunk. I'd been awake, completely awake, staring at something that shouldn't have been there. Marcus got out of bed and we went back to the guest room together. He stood in the corner where I'd seen the shape, spreading his arms to show there was nothing there, no hook for coats, no standing lamp, nothing that could cast that kind of shadow. We checked the closet, which contained nothing but empty hangers and a few old boxes on the floor. There was no explanation for what I'd experienced. We searched the rest of the house, Marcus humoring me even though I could tell he thought I was overreacting. We checked every room, every closet, even the basement, which was mostly just storage and his workshop. All the windows were locked from the inside, the doors too. There was no sign anyone had been in the house besides us. Back in the kitchen, Marcus made strong coffee while trying to reassure me. He told me the house was old, built in the 60s, and sometimes made weird noises that could seem like footsteps or movement. The isolation could play tricks on your mind too, he said, especially if you weren't used to it. The silence out here was different from city silence, fuller somehow, and it could make your brain fill in sounds and sights that weren't really there. I wanted to believe him, wanted to chalk the whole thing up to altitude sickness and too much whiskey, but something kept nagging at me. The way Marcus had looked when I first described what I'd seen, that flash of recognition before he'd covered it with concern. I pressed him on it, asked if anything weird had happened in that room before, if other guests had mentioned anything strange. He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee mug like it might hold answers. Finally, he admitted that I wasn't the first person to mention seeing something in that room. His ex-girlfriend had refused to sleep in there after one night, claiming she'd felt someone watching her. A cousin who'd visited had said something similar, though he'd assumed they were just trying to avoid staying in his rustic house. Marcus said he'd never experienced anything himself, had slept in that room multiple times when he first bought the house while renovating the master bedroom. But he admitted he'd stopped using it for guests after the second person complained, hence why it had become mostly storage. He'd honestly forgotten about those incidents until I'd brought it up, or at least that's what he claimed. We sat in uncomfortable silence after that revelation, neither of us quite sure what to say. The rational part of me still wanted a logical explanation, but the coincidence of multiple people experiencing something similar in that specific room was hard to dismiss. Marcus offered to look into the house's history, see if anything had happened there that might explain the experiences, though neither of us really believed in ghosts or supernatural explanations. By the time full daylight had arrived, the terror of the night felt distant and slightly silly. We ate breakfast, Marcus true to his word about driving me back to Denver himself since I was in no condition to drive. The trip back was mostly quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what had happened. We made promises to stay in better touch, to not let another 7 years pass, but there was an awkwardness now that hadn't been there before. I made my flight with plenty of time to spare, spending the hours in the air trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. By the time I landed in Florida, returning to my normal life of meetings and deadlines and city noise, the whole thing felt like something I might have imagined. But sometimes, usually when I'm in unfamiliar places, staying in hotels or guest rooms, I find myself checking the corners before I go to sleep, looking for tall shapes that shouldn't be there. Marcus and I still exchange messages occasionally, but he's never mentioned looking into the house's history like he promised. I've never asked either, not sure I really want to know what he might have found. Some questions are better left unanswered, some mysteries better left unsolved. But I know what I saw that night, or what I think I saw, and no amount of rationalization has ever fully explained it away. The last time Marcus messaged me about 6 months after my visit, he mentioned casually that he'd converted the guest room into a home office. Said he needed the space for work, but I wondered if there was more to it than that. I wondered if he'd finally experienced something himself, finally understood why multiple guests had reported the same unsettling feeling in that room. But I didn't ask, and he didn't offer any other explanation. I thought about going back to visit, to see his new office, to test whether the feeling would still be there. But I always find excuses not to make the trip. Too busy with work, too expensive, too far to travel. The truth is, I'm not sure I want to know if that shape in the corner was real or imagined. Some ambiguities are safer than certainty, some questions better left unasked. It's been 3 years now since that night in Marcus's guest room. I still don't sleep well in unfamiliar places, still find myself waking in the middle of the night to scan dark corners. My girlfriend thinks I'm paranoid, attributes it to work stress or too much caffeine, and I let her believe that's all it is. It's easier than trying to explain that one night in the mountains when I saw something that couldn't have been there but was. Marcus posted recently that he's selling the house, moving closer to Denver for a new job. Part of me wanted to ask if the guest room situation had anything to do with his decision, but I didn't. We maintain our careful distance now, our friendship forever changed by that one night when I stopped by for a visit. Sometimes reconnecting with the past opens doors that should have stayed closed, reveals things that were better left in darkness. I've never told anyone else this story in full, not even my girlfriend. It sounds too much like something from a bad horror movie, too cliché to be real. But I know what I experienced that night, know the fear that gripped me when I saw that shape in the corner, know the relief and confusion when it vanished with the dawn. Whether it was real or imagined doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that it changed something fundamental in how I see the world, made me aware that there are things we don't understand, can't explain, and maybe shouldn't try to. The rental car company called me a week after I got home, asking about the car I'd left in Marcus's driveway. I'd completely forgotten about it in my hungover state, had to pay extra fees for the late return and the transport back to Denver. It was an expensive reminder of that night, but somehow paying that bill felt like closing a chapter, putting distance between myself and whatever had stood in that corner, watching me sleep in the darkness of a mountain night. Sometimes I dream about that room, about the shape in the corner. In my dreams, it moves, steps forward out of the shadows, and I can almost make out features, almost understand what I'm looking at. But I always wake up before it fully reveals itself, heart racing, sheets soaked with sweat. Maybe that's for the best. Some revelations were not meant to receive, some truths were better off not knowing. I still wonder if Marcus knows more than he told me, if there's a reason he looked recognizable when I first described what I'd seen. I wonder if he's experienced things in that house he's never shared, if that's the real reason he's selling it now. But I'll never ask and he'll never tell, and maybe that's how it should be. Some stories are meant to remain unfinished, some questions meant to remain unanswered, and some shapes and corners are better left unexplained. The business conference in Denver had finally come to an end after 4 exhausting days of presentations, panel discussions, and endless networking events that all blurred together into one long corporate marathon. I was sitting in my hotel room on that last morning, my laptop finally closed for the first time since I'd arrived, contemplating how to spend my unexpected free day before my evening flight back to Florida, when my phone buzzed with a notification from Facebook Messenger that would change everything about how this trip would end. The name on the screen made me pause for a moment, trying to place it in my memory, and then it clicked into place with a wave of nostalgia that caught me off guard. Marcus Wheeler, someone I hadn't thought about in years but who had once been one of my closest friends during those intense college years when we'd both been struggling through our engineering degrees at the University of Michigan. We'd been inseparable back then, study partners who became genuine friends, spending countless nights in the library working through impossible problem sets, surviving on energy drinks and vending machine food, bonding over our shared misery and occasional triumphs. His message was simple and direct, saying he'd seen my posts about being in Denver for the conference and wondering if I had any time to catch up before heading home. The timing felt almost surreal, like the universe had conspired to create this moment, because just an hour earlier I'd been debating whether to spend my free day exploring downtown Denver or just staying in my hotel room recovering from the conference exhaustion. When I told him my flight wasn't until 8 that evening, his response was immediate and enthusiastic, insisting that I absolutely had to come visit him in the mountain town where he'd been living for the past 5 years, about 2 hours outside the city. The idea of escaping the generic corporate atmosphere of downtown Denver appealed to me more than I expected, and there was something about reconnecting with Marcus after all these years that felt important somehow, like closing a circle that had been left open since graduation. We'd stayed connected on social media in that passive way everyone does now, occasional likes on major life updates, birthday wishes that never led to actual conversations, watching each other's lives unfold through carefully curated posts without really knowing what was happening beneath the surface. I messaged him back confirming I'd rent a car and drive up, and his excitement came through even in text form, sending multiple messages about how great it would be to finally catch up properly, how much I'd love the mountains, how different his life was now from what we'd imagined back in college. He sent his address along with increasingly detailed directions, warning me that GPS sometimes got confused on the mountain roads, adding landmarks to watch for, making sure I'd be able to find his place even if technology failed me. The rental car process at the airport was surprisingly smooth for once, and soon I was navigating my way out of Denver's urban sprawl, watching the landscape transform gradually as I gained elevation. The city's concrete and glass gave way to scattered suburbs, then to foothills dotted with expensive-looking homes, and finally to genuine mountain terrain where pine forests pressed close to the winding road and massive rock formations jutted up like ancient monuments to geological time. The drive was more beautiful than I'd anticipated, each turn revealing new vistas that made me understand why people became obsessed with mountain living. My ears popped several times as I climbed higher, the rental car's engine working harder on the steep grades, and I found myself taking deeper breaths as the air thinned. The conference stress seemed to fall away with each mile I put between myself and the city, replaced by a sense of adventure I hadn't felt in years. Marcus's town, when I finally reached it, was barely a town at all, more like a collection of buildings that had agreed to exist near each other without forming anything resembling an actual community. There was a general store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, a gas station with only 2 pumps, and a scattering of houses and cabins spread out along dirt roads that branched off from the main highway like capillaries from an artery. His house sat at the end of one of these dirt roads, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the afternoon sun, creating a perpetual twilight even though it was only around 3 in the afternoon when I arrived. The structure itself was exactly what you'd expect from a mountain cabin, all weathered wood and rustic charm, with a metal roof that had developed a patina of rust and artistic patterns and a wraparound porch that sagged slightly in the middle like it was tired from decades of supporting people's mountain dreams. Marcus emerged from the front door before I'd even turned off the engine, and seeing him after 7 years was like looking at a familiar painting that had been restored with different colors. His face had weathered in a way that suited him, lines around his eyes from squinting in mountain sun, a full beard that hadn't existed in college, and a general roughness that replaced the soft edges of our academic years. But his smile was exactly the same, genuine and warm in a way that made you feel like you were the most important person in his world at that moment. The hug he gave me was fierce and real, not one of those perfunctory man hugs that avoid too much contact, but a genuine embrace that acknowledged the years of absence and the significance of this reunion. He pulled me inside immediately, talking rapidly about how incredible it was that I'd actually come, how he'd been hoping for years that someone from the old crowd would visit, how isolated mountain life could be despite its beauty. The interior of his house was a perfect reflection of Marcus himself, organized chaos that somehow worked, filled with projects in various stages of completion and evidence of a life lived deliberately outside mainstream society. The living room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace that he'd apparently rebuilt himself, bookshelves made from reclaimed wood that held an eclectic mix of engineering texts and philosophy books, and furniture that looked like it had been collected from various decades without any attempt at matching styles. He gave me the tour with obvious pride, pointing out renovations he'd completed, problems he'd solved with creative engineering solutions, and the various ways he'd made this old cabin into something uniquely his. The kitchen had been completely redone with salvaged restaurant equipment he'd bought when a place in Denver closed. The bathroom featured a clawfoot tub he'd hauled up the mountain in his truck, and his office was filled with computer equipment that seemed incongruous with the rustic setting, evidence of his remote work as a software engineer. We settled into his living room with craft beers from a local brewery he swore made the best IPA in Colorado, sinking into leather chairs that had clearly seen better days but were comfortable in that broken-in way that new furniture never achieves. The conversation started tentatively, feeling out the boundaries of our changed relationship, testing whether the easy friendship of our college years could be resurrected after so much time and change. But within an hour, it was like no time had passed at all, the old rhythms of our communication returning naturally as we filled each other in on the intervening years. Marcus told me about his decision to leave the traditional tech world, about buying this cabin with his savings and learning to live with minimal expenses, about the freedom and isolation of mountain life and how both were harder and more rewarding than he'd expected. I shared my own journey through corporate America, the compromises I'd made, the relationships that had failed under the pressure of constant travel and long hours, the growing sense that I was living someone else's definition of success. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows at increasingly sharp angles as we talked, the beers multiplying without either of us really counting, each one loosening more of the guardedness that adulthood had built around us. Marcus produced a bottle of local whiskey around 6 o'clock, something special he'd been saving, he said, for an occasion worth celebrating, and apparently my visit qualified. The whiskey was smooth and dangerous, the kind that went down too easily and made you forget how strong it was until you stood up and the room shifted slightly. Combined with the altitude, which I wasn't accustomed to coming from sea-level Florida, the alcohol hit me harder and faster than it normally would have. By 8 o'clock we were both properly drunk, not sloppy but definitely past the point of good judgment, laughing at memories that weren't really that funny but seemed hilarious through the lens of nostalgia and whiskey. Marcus started telling stories about the local characters he'd met since moving here, the old-timers who'd lived in these mountains for generations and regarded newcomers with deep suspicion, the various wildlife encounters he'd had, including a bear that had become somewhat of a regular visitor to his back porch. Each story led to another, the way drunk conversations do, meandering through topics without any clear direction but somehow feeling profound in the moment. The darkness outside became complete without us really noticing, the kind of absolute darkness you never experience in cities, where the only light came from the stars and the warm glow of Marcus's living room. Time became increasingly irrelevant as we drank and talked, the outside world ceasing to exist beyond the circle of our conversation and the crackling fire Marcus had built in the fireplace. It must have been close to midnight when I attempted to stand up to use the bathroom and realized just how drunk I was, the floor tilting in a way that floors definitely shouldn't tilt, my balance completely compromised by the combination of alcohol and altitude. Marcus laughed at my unsteady progress across his living room, but he wasn't in much better shape himself, having to grip the door frame when he stood up to point me toward the bathroom. When I returned, walking very carefully and deliberately like a person trying to prove they're not as drunk as they obviously are, Marcus was already pulling blankets and pillows from a closet. He declared there was absolutely no way he was letting me drive back to Denver in my current state, especially not on dark mountain roads that were challenging even when sober. I started to protest about my hotel room, my flight the next day, the rental car that needed to be returned, but he waved all of those concerns away with the confidence of the thoroughly intoxicated. He'd drive me back to Denver himself in the morning. He promised plenty of time to make my evening flight, no problem at all. The relief I felt at not having to navigate those winding mountain roads in the dark while drunk was immediate and overwhelming, and I accepted his offer with gratitude that probably came out more emotional than intended, the whiskey making everything feel more significant than it really was. I asked about taking the couch, which looked comfortable enough despite its obvious age, but Marcus insisted he had a proper guest room, though he apologized in advance for its condition. He rarely had visitors, he explained, and the room had become something of a storage area over the years, but it had a rail bed which would be infinitely better than sleeping on a couch with broken springs that would destroy my back. He led me down a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch longer than the house should have allowed, our drunken steps making the old floorboards creak in protest. The guest room was at the very back of the house, and when he opened the door, I was hit with the smell of a space that had been closed up for too long, musty and stale with undertones of old wood and something else I couldn't quite identify, something that made me think of abandoned places and forgotten things. The room was small, almost claustrophobically so after the openness of the living room, dominated by a double bed with what looked like handmade quilts piled on top. Boxes were stacked against one wall, labeled with fading marker that I couldn't read in the dim light from the single overhead bulb. Marcus apologized again for the state of things, grabbing a few boxes to clear a path to the bed, muttering about meaning to clean this room out for years but never getting around to it. He wished me good night with another of those genuine smiles, closing the door behind him and leaving me alone in the strange room. I stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, trying to take in my surroundings through the haze of alcohol, but my brain wasn't processing details properly anymore. The bed looked inviting enough, and that was all that really mattered in my current state. I collapsed onto the mattress without even taking off my shoes initially, then realized that was gross and struggled to remove them, a task that seemed impossibly complex with my current lack of coordination. The quilts smelled old but not unpleasant, like cedar chests and lavender, reminding me of my grandmother's house from childhood. I remember thinking I should set an alarm on my phone, should figure out the logistics of tomorrow, but sleep was already pulling me under with the irresistible force of alcohol-induced exhaustion. The first time I woke up, it was to a darkness so complete that for a moment I couldn't remember where I was, couldn't even tell if my eyes were open or closed. My mouth felt like I'd been eating cotton balls soaked in battery acid, and my head was beginning to pound with the early warnings of what would undoubtedly be a spectacular hangover. The altitude wasn't helping, making each breath feel insufficient, like I couldn't quite get enough oxygen no matter how deeply I inhaled. As I lay there trying to orient myself, trying to remember the sequence of events that had led me to this strange bed in this dark room, my eyes gradually began to adjust to the darkness. There must have been some source of light, maybe moonlight filtering through a window I hadn't noticed, because shapes slowly started to emerge from the absolute blackness. The stack of boxes against the wall became visible as a blocky shadow, the dresser materialized as a horizontal mass, and there in the corner of the room, something else took shape that my brain couldn't immediately categorize. At first, I thought it might be a coat rack or perhaps a standing lamp, something tall and thin that Marcus had failed to mention. But the longer I stared at it, the more wrong it seemed, the proportions not quite matching any furniture I could think of. It was too tall, probably 7 feet or more, and too narrow, with what looked like a wider section at the top that could have been shoulders if it had been a person standing perfectly still in the corner of the room. My rational mind, even compromised as it was by alcohol and disorientation, immediately rejected that possibility. People don't stand motionless in corners of guest rooms in the middle of the night. That's not a thing that happens in real life, only in horror movies and nightmares. It had to be something else, something mundane that my drunk brain was misinterpreting, shadows playing tricks that would seem ridiculous in the morning light. But I couldn't stop staring at it, couldn't shake the growing certainty that I was looking at a human silhouette, someone standing in the corner of the room watching me sleep. The shape had a quality of presence that inanimate objects don't possess, a weight to it that suggested consciousness and intention. I could almost feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see any features in the darkness, just that tall, dark shape that shouldn't have been there. My heart began racing, pumping adrenaline through my system that started to counteract some of the alcohol fog. I wanted to reach for my phone, to use its flashlight to prove to myself that I was being paranoid, but I'd left it on the nightstand, and suddenly the idea of moving, of making any sound that might draw attention to the fact that I was awake, seemed like the worst possible idea. I lay there frozen, barely breathing, watching that shape for any sign of movement, any indication that it was aware I was awake and watching it in return. Minutes passed like hours, the silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing through my ears. The shape remained perfectly still, unnaturally still in a way that made it seem even less likely to be a person, because surely no one could stand that motionless for that long. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being ridiculous, that I was having some kind of alcohol-induced paranoid episode that I'd laugh about in the morning. I forced myself to close my eyes, to roll over and face the wall instead of the corner, telling myself that when I looked again, I'd see whatever piece of furniture or pile of clothing was actually there. But even with my back to it, I could feel that presence, that sense of being observed that made my skin crawl and my muscles tense. I must have eventually fallen back asleep, though I don't remember drifting off, just the sudden transition from darkness to dim gray light that meant dawn was approaching. My head was pounding properly now, the full hangover asserting itself with vicious enthusiasm, and my mouth somehow felt even drier than before. I rolled over slowly, carefully, trying not to aggravate my headache, and immediately looked toward the corner where I'd seen that shape. The corner was completely empty. No coat rack, no standing lamp, no tall furniture of any kind, just bare walls meeting at a 90-degree angle with nothing to explain what I'd been staring at for who knows how long in the middle of the night. There was a closet door there, slightly ajar, but it was recessed into the wall in a way that couldn't have created the kind of three-dimensional shadow I'd seen. I sat up despite the way it made my head spin, scanning the room more carefully in the growing light. Everything else was exactly as I remembered it from my drunk arrival the night before. The boxes against the wall, the dresser with its collection of dust and random objects on top, the single window with thin curtains that did little to block the light. But that corner remained conspicuously empty, no explanation for what had seemed so real just hours before. The need to understand what I'd experienced overrode my hangover discomfort, and I got up on unsteady legs to examine the corner more closely. The floorboards there showed no unusual wear patterns that might indicate someone regularly standing in that spot. The walls had no hooks or fixtures that might have held something, and the closet when I opened it fully contained nothing but empty hangers and a few more boxes stacked on the floor. I made my way down the hallway to Marcus's room, my footsteps loud on the creaking floorboards despite my attempts to be quiet. His door was open and I could hear him snoring inside, the sound reassuring in its normalcy. It took several attempts to wake him, shaking his shoulder with increasing force until his eyes finally opened, bloodshot and confused. When I told him about what I'd seen in the night, his expression went through a series of changes that I couldn't quite interpret through my hangover haze. First confusion as his brain came online, then something that looked disturbingly like recognition, a flash of understanding that he quickly covered with concern. He sat up, rubbing his face with both hands, and asked me to describe exactly what I'd witnessed, his voice carefully neutral. I explained about waking up in the darkness, about the tall shape in the corner that looked like a person standing there watching me, about how it had been gone when dawn came. I tried to convey the absolute certainty I'd felt that someone had been in that room with me, even while acknowledging how insane it sounded in the rational light of morning. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression becoming increasingly troubled as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. He suggested that it had probably been a combination of factors creating a perfect storm of misperception. The altitude affecting my oxygen levels, the significant amount of alcohol we'd consumed, the unfamiliar environment, the complete darkness of mountain nights that city people weren't accustomed to. All of these things could combine to create vivid hallucinations or waking dreams that felt completely real in the moment. I wanted to accept this explanation, wanted to believe it was just my brain playing tricks on me, but something about his initial reaction, that flash of recognition I'd seen, made me push harder. I asked him directly if anyone else had ever reported seeing something similar in that room, if there was something about that space he wasn't telling me. Marcus got out of bed and suggested we make coffee before continuing this conversation, leading me to his kitchen where he busied himself with an elaborate pour-over coffee setup that gave him an excuse to avoid eye contact. As the water heated and the coffee dripped slowly through the filter, he finally admitted that I wasn't the first person to have an unusual experience in that room. His ex-girlfriend, Sarah, had stayed in that room once when they'd first started dating, back when he was still renovating the master bedroom. She'd woken him up in the middle of the night, terrified, claiming someone had been standing in the corner watching her sleep. He'd assumed she'd had a nightmare, but she'd refused to ever sleep in that room again, and their relationship had ended not long after for unrelated reasons, or at least that's what he'd told himself. Then about 2 years ago, his cousin had visited from Portland, and after one night in the guest room, had made an excuse to leave early, cutting short what was supposed to be a week-long visit. When pressed, the cousin had made vague comments about the room feeling wrong, about feeling watched, but hadn't elaborated further. Marcus had attributed it to his cousin being a city person uncomfortable with rural isolation, but now he wondered if there had been more to it. He admitted that after those 2 incidents, he'd stopped offering the room to guests, letting it become a storage space rather than dealing with whatever was happening in there. He'd slept in the room himself several times when he first bought the house, during the renovation period, and had never experienced anything unusual, which made him doubt the reports even while he couldn't entirely dismiss them. We went back to the guest room together, now fully lit by morning sun streaming through the window. Marcus stood in the corner where I'd seen the figure, spreading his arms to show the dimensions of the space, trying to demonstrate how shadows could play tricks in darkness. But even in full daylight, there was something about that corner that felt different from the rest of the room, a heaviness to the air that might have been imagination but felt tangible nonetheless. We searched the room thoroughly, looking for any explanation for what multiple people had experienced. Marcus even pulled up some of the floorboards in the corner, revealing nothing but dust and insulation. We checked the walls for hidden spaces, examined the closet for any signs of secret passages or panels, even went into the crawl space under that part of the house to see if something structural might be creating unusual shadows or optical illusions. Finding nothing, we expanded our search to the rest of the house, Marcus now fully invested in solving this mystery. We checked every room, every closet, the attic, the basement workshop where Marcus did his woodworking projects. All the windows were still locked from the inside, the doors showed no signs of tampering, and there was no evidence that anyone besides us had been in the house. Back in the kitchen with fresh cups of coffee, Marcus opened his laptop and started researching the history of his house and the surrounding area. The cabin had been built in 1963 by a man named Robert Hayworth, who had lived there alone until his death in 1987. The property had then sat empty for several years before being bought and sold by a series of owners who never seemed to stay long, though the real estate records didn't indicate any particular reason for the frequent turnovers. Marcus found an old newspaper article from 1988 about Robert Hayworth's death, which had apparently been somewhat unusual. He'd been found in the house several days after dying of what was determined to be natural causes, but the article mentioned that he'd been found in an unusual position, standing up against a wall in what was now the guest room, as if he'd been propped there after death. The police had investigated but found no evidence of foul play, ultimately ruling it a bizarre but natural death, possibly caused by a stroke or heart attack that had occurred while he was standing. This information sent chills down both our spines, the coincidence too striking to ignore. The corner where I'd seen the figure was approximately where Robert Hayworth's body had been found, according to the vague description in the article. Marcus looked genuinely disturbed by this revelation, all his earlier attempts at rational explanation falling away in the face of this unsettling connection. We spent the rest of the morning researching Robert Hayworth, finding precious little information about the man who'd lived alone in this mountain cabin for over 20 years. A few mentions in local historical society records indicated he'd been something of a recluse, rarely coming to town, living a self-sufficient life that predated the modern off-grid movement by decades. There were suggestions that he'd been fleeing something in his past, rumors of a tragedy that had driven him to isolation, but nothing concrete enough to appear in official records. Marcus drove me back to Denver as promised, but the 3-hour journey was mostly silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what had happened. The daylight and distance from the cabin made the experience feel increasingly surreal, like something I might have imagined, but the research we'd done, the confirmation that others had experienced something similar, made it impossible to simply dismiss. At the airport, as I was about to head to my gate, Marcus grabbed my arm and told me something he'd been holding back. After his cousin's visit, he'd set up a motion-activated camera in the guest room, curious to see if it would capture anything unusual. For 6 months, it had recorded nothing but dust motes and the occasional spider. Then one night, about 3 months ago, it had captured something that made him disconnect the camera and never set it up again. The footage had shown what appeared to be a tall shadow materializing in the corner around 3 a.m., standing perfectly still for approximately 4 hours before fading as dawn approached. There were no features visible, no clear indication it was a person, just a dark mass roughly human-shaped that shouldn't have been there. He tried to convince himself it was a malfunction, a trick of the infrared sensors, but deep down he knew it was something else, something he didn't want to acknowledge. He'd never told anyone about the footage, had deleted it in a moment of panic, afraid that acknowledging it would make it real in a way he wasn't prepared to handle. But my experience, so similar to what the camera had captured, made it impossible to continue denying that something was happening in that room, something connected to Robert Hayworth and his strange death. The flight back to Florida felt like traveling between worlds, leaving behind the thin mountain air and whatever presence haunted Marcus's guest room for the familiar humidity and predictability of my coastal life. But the experience had changed something fundamental in my perception of reality, created a crack in my understanding of what was possible that couldn't be sealed by rational explanation or distance. I threw myself back into work with unusual intensity, trying to lose myself in spreadsheets and meetings and the mundane problems of corporate life. But at night, especially when I was alone in unfamiliar places like hotel rooms during business trips, I found myself checking corners, looking for tall shadows that didn't belong, unable to shake the feeling of being watched that had been so intense in that mountain cabin. Marcus and I stayed in touch more regularly after that visit, our shared experience creating a bond that our college friendship hadn't quite achieved. He never mentioned setting up the camera again, and I never asked if he'd experienced anything else in the guest room. About 8 months after my visit, he sent me a message saying he'd converted the guest room into a home office, removing the bed and filling the space with computer equipment and bookshelves. He included a photo of the renovation, and I noticed immediately that he'd positioned his desk so that it faced away from that corner, had placed a tall bookshelf right where the figure had stood, as if physically blocking the space might prevent whatever had been happening there. He didn't comment on this arrangement, and I didn't mention noticing it, but we both understood what he was trying to do. A year after my visit, Marcus sent another message, this time announcing that he was selling the cabin and moving to Denver. He'd gotten a job offer he couldn't refuse, he said, requiring him to be in the office regularly rather than working remotely. It was a good opportunity, a chance to advance his career, all perfectly logical reasons for leaving his mountain retreat. But I wondered if there was more to it, if something had finally happened that made staying impossible. I considered asking him directly, considered flying out to help him move and perhaps getting one last look at that guest room, now office, to see if I could still feel that presence in the corner. But I never did, recognizing that some doors, once closed, should remain that way. Marcus sold the cabin to a young couple from California looking for a mountain getaway, and I've often wondered if they kept the guest room as an office or converted it back to its original purpose. The last time Marcus and I talked about that night was about 2 years after my visit. He'd had a few drinks and called me late one evening, wanting to tell me something he'd discovered while packing up the cabin. In the attic, behind some insulation, he'd found a journal that appeared to have belonged to Robert Hayworth. Most of it was mundane observations about weather and wildlife, records of repairs done to the cabin, that sort of thing. But the final entries, dating from the weeks before his death, described increasing episodes of sleep paralysis and the persistent feeling of someone standing in his bedroom watching him sleep. The last entry, dated 3 days before his body was found, was just one line that made both of us question everything we thought we understood about what had happened in that room. Robert had written, "I see myself standing in the corner again, waiting patiently for me to join him." Marcus had burned the journal after reading that, unable to bear having it in his possession, but the words had been seared into his memory and now mine as well. We never discussed what that entry might mean, whether Robert had been experiencing some kind of psychological break or if something more inexplicable had been occurring. The ambiguity was somehow worse than knowing for certain would have been, leaving us with questions that had no satisfying answers and implications we didn't want to fully consider. It's been 5 years now since that night in Marcus's guest room, and I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. My girlfriend has noticed my peculiar habit of checking corners in dark rooms, my insistence on keeping a night light in unfamiliar places, but I've never told her the full story. How do you explain something like that without sounding insane, without diminishing it by trying to put it into words that can't capture the visceral reality of the experience? Marcus lives in a modern apartment in downtown Denver now, all glass and steel and clean lines, as far from that rustic mountain cabin as possible. We see each other occasionally when I have business in Denver, meeting for drinks in bright, crowded bars where shadows can't gather in corners and the noise of other people provides constant reassurance of normalcy. We talk about work, about relationships, about everything except that night and what we discovered afterward. Sometimes, though, I catch him glancing at dark corners with the same wariness I feel, see him position himself in rooms so his back is never to an empty space, and I know he carries the same unease I do. We're bound together by this shared knowledge of something that shouldn't exist but does, something that waits patiently in corners for reasons we'll never understand. The young couple who bought Marcus's cabin posted photos on Instagram for about a year, showing their renovations and improvements, their attempts to make the space their own. Then the posts stopped abruptly, and the property appeared back on the market 6 months later. The real estate listing mentioned that the sellers were motivated, having to relocate for work, the same kind of vague explanation that had probably been given by every owner since Robert Hayworth's death. I've thought about reaching out to them, asking carefully worded questions about their experience in the house, particularly about that back bedroom. But I always stop myself, recognizing that some knowledge is a burden rather than a gift, that confirming my suspicions wouldn't change anything and might only spread the unease that Marcus and I carry. The cabin sold again recently. According to the property records, Marcus still monitors out of morbid curiosity. The new owners are apparently using it as a vacation rental, which means a steady stream of strangers will be sleeping in that guest room, most of them blissfully unaware of its history. I wonder how many of them will wake in the middle of the night to see a tall figure standing in the corner. How many will convince themselves it was just a dream, just shadows, just their imagination playing tricks? And I wonder about Robert Hayworth, alone in that cabin for all those years, experiencing something that drove him to write about seeing himself standing in corners. Was it madness, or was there something about that space, that particular corner of that particular room, that served as some kind of threshold between states of being? Did he eventually join whatever was waiting for him there, becoming the presence that others would later encounter? These are questions without answers, mysteries that resist any attempt at rational explanation. Marcus and I have our theories, discussed in hushed tones during those late-night drinking sessions, but none of them feel adequate to explain what we experienced. The best we can do is carry this knowledge carefully, like handling something sharp that could cut us if we grip it too tightly, and try to live normal lives despite knowing that normalcy is more fragile than most people realize. Every now and then I check the vacation rental reviews for the cabin, looking for any mention of unusual experiences or uncomfortable nights. So far, the reviews have been uniformly positive, praising the rustic charm and mountain views, the peace and quiet of the location. But I keep watching, waiting for the inevitable review that will mention something strange about the back bedroom, a feeling of being watched, a shadow in the corner that shouldn't be there. When that review appears, as I'm certain it eventually will, I'll want to reach out to the person who wrote it, to tell them they're not crazy, that others have experienced the same thing. But I won't, because what would be the point? Some experiences are too far outside the boundaries of normal life to be shared casually, too strange to be believed by anyone who hasn't experienced them directly. So I carry this story quietly, this knowledge that there are things in the world that don't fit into our understanding of how reality works. It's made me both more skeptical and more open-minded, more likely to dismiss obvious hoaxes but also more willing to consider that seemingly impossible things might occasionally be true. It's a paradox I've learned to live with, a complexity that's replaced the simpler worldview I had before that night. Marcus called me last week to tell me he's getting married, wanting me to be a groomsman at his wedding next summer. He seems happy, settled in a way he never was in that mountain cabin, and I'm genuinely glad for him. But I noticed he mentioned they're looking for a house in Denver, specifically wanting something modern, built recently, with no history to speak of. He didn't elaborate on this preference and I didn't ask, but we both understood what he was really saying. The wedding will be the first time we've spent extended time together since my visit to the cabin, and I wonder if we'll finally talk about it properly, or if we'll continue our mutual silence on the subject. Either way, I'll be there to support him, bound to him not just by our college friendship but by this shared experience that no one else would believe or understand. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about driving back to that cabin, renting it for a night, and deliberately sleeping in that back bedroom to see if I'd experience something again. It's a morbid curiosity that I'll never act on, a temptation I recognize as dangerous for reasons I can't fully articulate. Some things, once experienced, leave marks on your psyche that never fully fade, and I have no desire to deepen those marks. The story I've told here is as complete and accurate as I can make it, though I know how it must sound to anyone reading it. Like a hallucination, a dream, a fiction created by altitude and alcohol and the power of suggestion. I wouldn't blame anyone for dismissing it, for finding rational explanations for every strange element. That's what I would have done before that night, what I sometimes still try to do when the memory feels too unsettling to carry. But Marcus and I know what we experienced, what others experienced in that room before and after us, and what Robert Hayworth experienced in the weeks before his death. We know that sometimes reality has thin spots, places where the normal rules don't quite apply, where things that shouldn't be possible occasionally occur. That guest room in that mountain cabin was one of those places, and whatever existed there, whatever still exists there, changed our understanding of the world in ways we're still processing. This is my testimony, my attempt to document something that defies easy explanation, to add my voice to the scattered accounts of people who've encountered things that shouldn't exist but do. I don't expect to convince anyone who hasn't had a similar experience, but perhaps someone reading this who has seen their own impossible thing will feel less alone, less crazy, knowing that others have stood in dark rooms watching shadows that shouldn't be there and lived to question everything afterward. The rental cabin's reviews finally showed something interesting last month. A guest mentioned in passing that they'd had to switch bedrooms in the middle of their stay because the back room felt oppressive, though they couldn't explain why. They gave the property 4 stars instead of 5, citing only that vague discomfort as a negative. It was the first crack in the uniformly positive reviews, and I knew it was only a matter of time before someone else had a more explicit experience. Marcus saw the review too, sending me a screenshot with no comment attached. We've developed this wordless communication about anything related to the cabin, sharing updates without discussing them, maintaining our careful distance from the experience while being unable to completely let it go. His wedding is in 3 months, and I've already booked my flights, wondering if being his groomsman will finally give us the opportunity or the courage to properly discuss what happened that night and everything we learned afterward. The strangest part of carrying this experience is how it's changed my relationship with uncertainty. Before that night, I lived in a world of clear boundaries between possible and impossible, real and imagined, rational and irrational. Now I exist in a space where those boundaries are more like suggestions, where I've learned to hold multiple contradictory possibilities in my mind simultaneously without needing to resolve them into a single truth. This has made me, paradoxically, both more and less credulous about unusual claims. I'm quicker to dismiss obvious fabrications and attention-seeking stories, but I'm also more willing to consider that occasionally, rarely, someone might be telling the truth about something that sounds impossible. I've become a connoisseur of genuine strangeness, able to recognize the particular quality of confusion and reluctance that marks real encounters with the inexplicable. I've started collecting similar stories, not actively seeking them out but noting them when I encounter them. The security guard who quit after seeing someone who couldn't have been there, the family who sold their house after 6 months because of something they wouldn't discuss, the hotel room that's always available even when the rest of the property is booked solid. These stories form a pattern that's only visible if you know what to look for, a hidden geography of places where reality is thinner than it should be. Marcus and I are part of this invisible community now, people who've seen behind the curtain and can't unsee what we've witnessed. We recognize each other somehow, those of us who've had these experiences, though we rarely talk about them directly. It's in the way we position ourselves in rooms, the way we check corners, the way we pause sometimes and look at perfectly ordinary spaces as if seeing something others can't. I thought about writing a book about it, about trying to document these experiences in a systematic way, but I always stop myself. Who would believe it? And more importantly, what would be the point? Some knowledge is meant to remain liminal, existing in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between the known and the unknown. To try to force it into the light of academic scrutiny would be to lose something essential about its nature. The couple who bought the cabin from Marcus reached out to him recently through Facebook, asking if he'd experienced anything unusual during his time there. He forwarded me the message asking what he should tell them. We both knew they wouldn't be asking unless something had happened, unless they'd encountered whatever waits in that corner. After much debate, Marcus told them a carefully edited version of the truth, enough to let them know they weren't imagining things but not enough to burden them with the full weight of what we'd discovered. They responded with relief and terror in equal measure, sharing their own experience of waking to find a tall figure in their bedroom, of feeling watched, of gradually becoming unable to sleep properly in their own home. They'd already decided to sell before reaching out to Marcus, just wanting confirmation that they weren't losing their minds. He gave them that confirmation, that gift of sanity, while carefully avoiding any speculation about what the presence might be or want. This is how the knowledge spreads, quietly, carefully, between people who've had no choice but to accept that the world contains things that don't fit into our understanding. We form an accidental support group, validating each other's experiences while offering no solutions because we have none to give. The best we can do is say, yes, that happened, you're not crazy, and now you have to find a way to live with knowing this. I've become oddly protective of that corner in Marcus's old cabin, checking the rental listing regularly to make sure the photos don't show anything unusual, monitoring reviews for any mention of genuine terror rather than just discomfort. I'm not sure what I would do if someone posted clear evidence of something in that room, but I feel responsible somehow for managing the secret, for keeping it contained to those of us who've already been affected. The truth is that I'm grateful for the experience, despite the fear it caused and the uncertainty it's created. It's opened my mind in ways that have made life richer and stranger, more mysterious and potentially meaningful. If reality can contain impossibilities like what I saw that night, then what else might be possible? What other mysteries are hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal themselves? Marcus feels differently, I think. For him, the experience was a violation of the rational world he'd built his life around, an unwelcome intrusion of chaos into his carefully ordered existence. His move to Denver, his upcoming marriage, his choice of modern, history-free living spaces, all of it speaks to a desire to rebuild the walls between himself and whatever touched his life in that cabin. I respect that choice, that need to return to normalcy, even as I've chosen a different path of cautious curiosity. Sometimes I dream about that corner, but in my dreams it's not frightening anymore. The figure is still there, tall and silent and waiting, but I understand somehow that it's not malevolent, just displaced, existing in a space between states that we don't have language to describe. In these dreams, Robert Hayworth is there too, not as a ghost but as someone who discovered something about the nature of consciousness and existence that he couldn't quite integrate into life, something that eventually pulled him into that corner where he was found. These dreams might be my subconscious trying to make sense of the senseless, to create meaning where none exists. Or they might be glimpses of some deeper truth that can only be accessed in sleep, when the rational mind relaxes its grip on what's possible. I've learned to be comfortable with not knowing which interpretation is correct, with holding both possibilities simultaneously without needing to choose between them. The upcoming wedding will be a reunion of sorts with my old self, the person I was before that night in the cabin. I'll put on a tuxedo, give a speech about knowing Marcus since college, dance at the reception, and pretend that we're just normal people with a normal friendship based on normal shared experiences. And in a way that will be true too. We are normal people, living normal lives, who just happen to encounter something abnormal that we now carry with us like a shared secret. I've already written my speech for the wedding, carefully avoiding any mention of visiting Marcus in Colorado, focusing instead on our college years and his bright future with his fiancée. But I know that when I look at him during the ceremony, we'll both be thinking about that night, about what we discovered, about the strange bond it created between us. It's a weight we'll carry forever, lighter now with time and distance but never completely gone. The world is full of mysteries that most people never encounter, full of thin places where the impossible becomes possible for brief moments before reality reasserts itself. Marcus and I stumbled into one of those places by accident, by the coincidence of a conference in Denver and a drunken night in a mountain cabin. We saw something we shouldn't have seen, learned something we shouldn't have known, and now we have to live with that knowledge for the rest of our lives. This story, as long and detailed as it's become, still feels incomplete, like I'm trying to describe a color that doesn't exist in the normal spectrum or a sound outside the range of human hearing. Words are inadequate tools for conveying experiences that exist outside the boundaries of normal language, but they're all I have to document what happened, to prove to myself that it was real, that Marcus and I didn't imagine the whole thing. The cabin still stands in those Colorado mountains, still receives guests who sleep in that back bedroom, most of whom have perfectly normal stays unmarred by any unusual experiences. But occasionally, maybe once or twice a year based on the reviews I've tracked, someone has an encounter with whatever resides in that corner, and another person joins our invisible community of those who know that reality is stranger and more flexible than we're taught to believe. I'll never go back to that cabin, never deliberately put myself in the presence of whatever exists in that corner. But I'm grateful I was there that night, grateful for the fear and confusion and subsequent research that opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered. It's made me more humble about what I claim to know about the world, more open to mystery, more willing to accept that some questions don't have answers and some experiences don't have explanations. Marcus and I will dance at his wedding, laugh with old friends, celebrate his new beginning in a bright, modern reception hall where shadows behave properly and corners contain nothing but empty space. We'll pretend, for that night at least, that we're still the people we were before, unburdened by impossible knowledge. But we'll know the truth, carry it quietly between us, this understanding that the world is far stranger than most people will ever realize. And sometimes, in quiet moments when I'm alone, I think about Robert Hayworth in his final days, writing about seeing himself standing in corners, waiting patiently. I wonder if he understood something we don't, if his death wasn't tragic but transcendent in some way we can't comprehend. I wonder if what we saw in that corner was him, still watching, still waiting, still trying to communicate something important about the nature of existence that we're not ready to understand. These are thoughts I'll never share with Marcus, theories too disturbing to voice even to the one person who might understand. Some ideas are too dangerous to speak aloud, too likely to take root and grow into obsessions that could consume us. So I keep them locked away, examining them occasionally like dangerous artifacts that must be handled with extreme care. The story ends here, not because it's complete but because this is as far as I can follow it with words. What happened in that cabin exists partially outside language, outside rational explanation, outside the boundaries of normal experience. Marcus and I touched something impossible and lived to tell about it, though the telling will always be inadequate, will always fail to capture the full reality of what we encountered. We are sentinels now, keepers of impossible knowledge, members of a brotherhood we never asked to join. We watch the reviews of that cabin, track its sales and rentals, monitor from a distance the thing we can never quite escape. And late at night, when the world is quiet and shadows gather in corners, we remember what we saw and wonder what else might be hiding in the spaces between what we know and what we think we know. This is my testimony, as complete as I can make it, though it will never be complete enough. Somewhere in the Colorado mountains, in a cabin surrounded by pine trees, in a back bedroom that's been many things over the years, something waits in a corner for reasons we'll never understand. And sometimes, when the conditions are right and the observer is receptive, it reveals itself, adding another person to our ranks of those who know that the world is stranger than we dare to believe. The forest campsite. The soccer tournament had brought hundreds of families to the small Swedish city that weekend, which meant every hotel and campsite within 50 kilometers was completely booked by the time we arrived. My parents, my friend Anna, and I had driven 8 hours from Stockholm for what was supposed to be a simple weekend trip to the amusement park, but poor planning left us searching desperately for somewhere to spend the night as darkness approached. My father scrolled through booking sites on his phone while we sat in the car outside the last fully booked campsite, the rejection from the owner still stinging as we watched other families setting up their tents in the designated areas. The car felt smaller with each passing minute, filled with the tension of poor planning and the growing realization that we might have to drive all the way back home without even visiting the park we'd come to see. That's when my father found a parking area on the map, a small gravel lot in a nature reserve about 20 minutes away where we could theoretically set up our tents without getting fined. It wasn't ideal, sleeping rough in a forest rather than a proper campsite with facilities, but exhaustion and stubbornness made the decision for us. We'd come this far, and we weren't going to give up without at least trying to salvage the weekend. The drive to the nature reserve took us away from civilization and into increasingly dense forest, the GPS guiding us down narrow roads that seemed to get darker with each turn despite it still being early evening. Anna and I sat quietly in the back seat, both of us sensing our parents' stress and trying not to make things worse with complaints or concerns about the increasingly isolated location. When we finally found the parking area, it was little more than a cleared space of gravel surrounded by towering trees that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. There was one other car there, an old sedan that looked like it had been abandoned, rust eating through the wheel wells and leaves accumulated on the windshield suggesting it hadn't moved in weeks or possibly months. A woman emerged from a hiking trail as we were getting out of our car, and my mother immediately asked her if it was safe to camp here, if parking enforcement came through, if she knew anything about the area. The woman assured us it was fine, that she'd seen other people camp here before without any problems, though something in her expression suggested she wouldn't personally choose to spend the night in this particular spot. We set up our 2 tents close together in the gravel lot, my parents taking one while Anna and I shared the other. The process was frustrating in the dying light, poles getting tangled, stakes refusing to hold in the loose gravel, everyone's tempers fraying as we struggled with equipment we hadn't used in years. By the time we finished, full darkness had settled over the forest, and the only light came from our phones and a single flashlight my father had remembered to pack. Anna and I made our tent as comfortable as possible with sleeping bags and pillows, trying to create a cozy atmosphere despite the uncomfortable ground beneath us. We lay there watching videos on our phones, sharing earbuds, eating snacks we'd bought at a gas station, trying to pretend this was a fun adventure rather than the result of poor planning. The forest around us was alive with sounds that city kids like us couldn't identify, rustles and calls and creaks that our imaginations turned into threats. Around midnight, we decided to try to sleep, knowing we needed to be up early for the amusement park the next day. My parents were already quiet in their tent, presumably asleep, and the parking lot had taken on an eerie quality in the complete darkness. That's when we heard the first sound that didn't belong, a metallic scraping like someone dragging a shovel across the gravel. Anna grabbed my arm so hard it hurt, both of us frozen in our sleeping bags, hardly daring to breathe. The sound had come from the direction of the abandoned car, and as we listened, we heard what sounded like a trunk opening, something heavy being loaded or unloaded, then the trunk slamming shut with a force that echoed through the forest. We stayed perfectly still as an engine started, the abandoned car that we'd assumed was broken suddenly roaring to life. The headlights blazed on, sweeping across our tents as the car turned, and we could see our shadows thrown against the tent walls before the vehicle sped away down the forest road, gravel spraying behind it in its haste to leave. I texted a friend who lived in the area, telling him where we were camping, needing someone to know our location in case something happened. His response chilled me to the bone. He said that beach nearby was known for criminal activity, that bodies had been found in the forest, that we needed to leave immediately. But it was past midnight, we were exhausted, and the idea of packing up and driving in the dark seemed impossible. 10 minutes of tense silence passed before we heard the scream. It came from deep in the forest, a man's voice raised in absolute terror or agony, the kind of sound that human throats shouldn't be able to make. It went on for what felt like forever but was probably only seconds, cutting off abruptly in a way that was somehow worse than the scream itself. I called my mother immediately, whispering urgently that we'd heard someone screaming in the forest. She answered groggily, saying she hadn't heard anything, that we were probably just scared and imagining things. But then she admitted she'd heard it too, had been lying awake hoping we hadn't noticed, not wanting to frighten us further. We decided to stay in our tent but remain awake and alert, phones ready to call police if necessary. The silence that followed the scream was oppressive, pressing in on us from all sides. Then we heard footsteps on the gravel, slow and deliberate, circling our tents. Someone was walking around our campsite in the middle of the night, stopping occasionally as if examining our setup. Anna and I lay completely still, barely breathing as the footsteps moved from our tent to my parents' tent, then to our car, then back to where we lay. We could hear breathing now, heavy and labored, like someone who'd been running or was struggling with some intense emotion. The person stood outside our tent for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, just breathing, just standing there in the darkness. The car from earlier returned, its headlights once again illuminating our tents, and we heard a door slam before it sped away again. Shortly after, a police car raced past on the forest road, lights flashing but no siren, heading in the same direction the other car had gone. We never found out what they were chasing or if they caught it. Anna and I couldn't stand being in the tent anymore, feeling too vulnerable in the thin fabric shelter, so we moved to the car and locked ourselves in. We stayed awake until dawn, taking turns watching the forest for any sign of movement, any indication that whoever had been walking around our campsite might return. When the sun finally rose, we woke my parents and packed up faster than we'd ever packed anything in our lives. It wasn't until weeks later that I researched the area and discovered the truth about where we'd camped. Multiple people had gone missing from that forest over the years, and just months before our visit, a man had been murdered there in what police described as a drug-related incident. The abandoned car we'd seen had been connected to criminal activity in the area, used as a drop point for illegal substances. To this day, I wonder what we really experienced that night. Who was walking around our tents and what did they want? What was being buried or dug up with that shovel? Whose scream echoed through the forest and why did it stop so abruptly? And most disturbing of all, if that person hadn't been scared off by the returning car or the approaching police, what might have happened to two teenage girls alone in a tent in the middle of a forest known for violence? The voice in the stairwell. I was 6 years old when this happened, but the memory remains crystal clear in a way that most childhood memories don't, burned into my consciousness by pure terror. My brother Keith was 8 at the time, and we shared a large bedroom on the second floor of our family's old Victorian house in Massachusetts, a creaky place full of strange noises that we'd learned to ignore. Our father was strict about bedtime, 8:30 sharp every night without exception, and getting caught out of bed after that time meant consequences we didn't want to face. Our parents' bedroom was downstairs, far enough away that they couldn't hear us if we whispered, but close enough that they'd definitely hear if we walked around on the old floorboards that groaned under the slightest weight. I woke up that night to Keith shaking my shoulder, his hand over my mouth to keep me from making noise. When I looked at him in the dim light from the hallway, his eyes were wide with something I'd never seen before, real fear rather than the fake scared he'd pretend when telling ghost stories. He whispered for me to listen, and that's when I heard it too. Our mother's voice was calling us from downstairs, but it was wrong somehow, too quiet, too sweet, like she was trying to coax us down without waking our father. She kept repeating our names in this sing-song way that our real mother never used, a voice that sounded like her but wasn't quite right, like someone doing an impersonation that was almost but not quite perfect. I started to get up, assuming she needed us for something, maybe one of us had left something downstairs that needed to be put away. But Keith grabbed my arm and pulled me back, insisting that it wasn't really our mother, that something was wrong. I thought he was trying to scare me, playing one of his older brother tricks, and I told him to stop it. The voice continued calling us, never getting louder or more insistent, just that same sweet tone repeating our names over and over. I was getting angry at Keith for holding me back, for trying to frighten me when our mother clearly needed us for something. So I did what little brothers do, I decided to prove him wrong by being braver than him. I crept to our bedroom door and pressed my ear against it, hearing the voice more clearly now. It was definitely coming from the bottom of the stairs, and it definitely sounded like our mother, but Keith's fear had infected me enough that I hesitated before opening the door. When I finally gathered the courage to crack it open just enough to peer out, I saw something that still appears in my nightmares decades later. At the bottom of the stairs, barely visible in the darkness but definitely there, was the silhouette of a woman. She was the right height to be our mother, the right shape, but something about the way she stood was fundamentally wrong. She was too still, like a mannequin, and when she noticed the door opening, her head snapped up to look at me with a movement that was too quick, too mechanical. She said hello in that same sweet voice and asked me to come down, said she had something special to show me, a surprise that couldn't wait until morning. But now that I could see her, I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't our mother. The shape was wrong, the posture, the way she held herself. This was someone or something else wearing a disguise that was good enough to fool us in the dark. I slammed the door and locked it, then ran back to our bedroom and locked that door too. Keith and I agreed to scream as loud as we could to wake our parents, and on the count of 3, we started yelling and stomping on the floor, making as much noise as 2 terrified children could make. It only took seconds for our parents to come running up the stairs, our father pounding on the locked door and demanding we open it immediately. When we finally let them in, they saw our genuine terror and listened to our story. Our mother was particularly disturbed, confirming that she had not been downstairs, had not been calling us, had been asleep in bed until our screaming woke her. She asked us to describe the woman, but all we could say was that she'd looked wrong, stood wrong, moved wrong. Our father went downstairs to check the house while our mother stayed with us, and I remember the way she kept looking at the door, the way she told us we'd done the right thing by locking it and screaming for help. When our father came back, he said he'd found the back door unlocked, standing slightly open, though he was certain he'd locked it before bed as he always did. The police came and took our statements, though I could tell they thought we just had nightmares or were making things up. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been in the house besides us. But our parents believed us, or at least believed that we'd experienced something real enough to terrify us. Years later, when I was in high school, my mother finally told me what she and my father had suspected but never wanted us to know as children. My father's estranged sister had been released from a psychiatric facility around the time of the incident. She'd had a breakdown years before we were born, had become convinced that my brother and I were actually her children that my parents had stolen from her. She'd been sending letters to the house that my parents had been hiding from us, increasingly unhinged messages about coming to take back what was hers. The night of the incident was the last time she ever tried to contact us, and my parents believed she'd somehow gotten into the house, had stood at the bottom of those stairs trying to lure us down for reasons we'll never fully understand. They never found her after that night, and she never tried to make contact again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone down those stairs, if I'd trusted that voice that sounded so much like my mother's. Would she have tried to take us? Hurt us? Or was there something even stranger going on? Something that doesn't have a rational explanation, like a disturbed relative? Keith and I never talked about it much as we grew older, but we both developed habits that our respective spouses find odd. We both check locks obsessively, both position our bedrooms so we can see the door from our beds, both have this instinctive distrust of voices calling from other rooms. Some childhood experiences mark you in ways that never fully fade. The man who followed me home. I was 16 and stupid in the way that 16-year-olds often are, convinced that bad things happen to other people but never to me. It was a Saturday night, and I was at my friend Haley's house with a group of girls from school, enjoying the freedom of her parents being out of town, though we weren't doing anything particularly wild, just hanging out and gossiping and eating junk food. The evening took an unexpected turn when a group of boys from our school showed up, invited by Haley without telling the rest of us. Among them was Brandon, a boy I had complicated history with, someone I dated briefly and ended badly with, someone I really didn't want to see. Haley thought she was being helpful, trying to force us back together, but it just made everything awkward and uncomfortable. After an hour of stilted conversation and meaningful looks from Haley that I ignored, I decided to leave. It was only about a 20-minute walk home through our suburban neighborhood, and I'd done it dozens of times before. My mother was out on a date and had told me to either get a ride or walk home if she was out late, so I wasn't breaking any rules by leaving. I texted Haley that I was upset with her for inviting Brandon without telling me, and she kept begging me to come back, apologizing profusely, but I was already walking and my anger kept me moving forward. The neighborhood was quiet, most houses dark, the street lamps providing pools of light that I moved between like islands of safety. About 5 minutes into my walk, I became aware of footsteps behind me. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up, they sped up. I turned around to see a middle-aged man about 30 feet behind me, wearing a hooded sweatshirt with his hands in his pockets, smiling at me in a way that made my skin crawl. He called out a greeting, asking how I was doing, his voice friendly in that aggressive way that sets off alarm bells. I responded with a brief "hi" and kept walking, but he maintained his distance behind me, following me through each turn I made. The logical part of my brain said he was probably just walking in the same direction, but the instinctive part knew something was wrong. After another few minutes, he called out again, commenting on the weather, trying to engage me in conversation. I gave another short response and walked faster, but he kept pace. Then he said something that changed everything. He said he wasn't going to hurt me, that he knew where I lived, that my house was near the elementary school. The fact that he knew where I lived, that he'd been watching me before, sent ice through my veins. I turned around and screamed at him to leave me alone, then started running. I heard him running behind me, his footsteps heavy on the pavement, getting closer. I screamed for help as loud as I could, screamed that someone was chasing me, screamed until my throat felt raw. Lights came on in the houses around me, and I saw curtains moving as people looked out. A couple came out of their house and I ran to them, explaining that a man was following me. He disappeared into the darkness the moment people started appearing, but the couple believed me and let me wait in front of their house until Brandon arrived to pick me up. The irony wasn't lost on me that the boy I'd been avoiding was the one who came to my rescue. He drove me home and I was so shaken that I asked him to stay. My mother still wasn't home and the idea of being alone in the house was terrifying. We sat in the living room talking, the awkwardness from earlier replaced by my genuine gratitude for his presence. Around 1 in the morning, we heard footsteps outside the house, circling from the front to the back. Then the gate to our backyard opened, the distinctive squeak unmistakable. Brandon and I looked out my bedroom window, which faced the backyard, but we couldn't see anyone in the darkness. Then a man's voice called up, saying he could see us there, that he knew we were watching. Brandon yelled that we were calling the police, and we did immediately. The man must have left because we didn't hear anything else, but the police arrived within minutes and stayed parked outside our house for the rest of the night. When my mother finally came home around 3 in the morning, she was horrified by what had happened. The incident changed everything about how I lived my life. My mother installed a complete security system with cameras around the entire property. I never walked anywhere alone at night again, always getting rides even for short distances. The feeling of being hunted, of being watched and followed, created an anxiety that took years to fade. We never found out who the man was or why he'd fixated on me. The fact that he knew where I lived suggested he'd been watching me for a while, possibly following me before without me noticing. The police increased patrols in our neighborhood, but nothing ever came of it, no arrests, no identification, just the knowledge that somewhere out there was a man who'd tried to grab a teenage girl and gotten away with it. My mother sold that house a year later, partly because of the housing market but mostly because she couldn't stand seeing me afraid in my own home. Every time I went in the backyard, I remembered that voice calling up to my window. Every time I walked to my car, I checked the shadows for movement. The safety I'd taken for granted was gone, replaced by a vigilance that exhausted me. Even now, 20 years later, I still check behind me when I walk, still position myself in public spaces so I can see all the exits, still feel my heart rate spike when footsteps match mine for too long. Some experiences teach you that the world is dangerous in ways you never imagined, that predators exist and sometimes choose you for reasons you'll never understand, and that vigilance is the price of safety. Brandon and I ended up dating again after that night, trauma bonding over the shared experience. It didn't last, but I'll always be grateful that he came when I called, that he stayed when I was scared, that he didn't leave me alone to face whatever that man had planned. Sometimes the people we're trying to avoid end up being exactly who we need. The photograph that changed. I inherited my grandmother's house in rural Oregon after she passed away, a 2-story farmhouse that had been in our family for 3 generations. I spent a week there sorting through her belongings, deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what secrets she'd kept hidden in closets and attics for decades. On the 3rd day, I found a box of old photographs in the basement, most of them the typical family snapshots you'd expect from the 1940s through the 1980s. But one photograph stood out immediately, not because of what it showed, but because of how it felt wrong to look at. It was a picture of my grandmother's living room from what looked like the 1960s, showing her old floral couch, the brick fireplace, and several people I didn't recognize sitting stiffly for the camera. What bothered me was that the more I looked at the photograph, the more certain I became that it was changing. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in small ways that made me question my memory. The first time I looked at it, I could have sworn there were 4 people in the photo. When I looked again an hour later, there were definitely 5. The woman on the right side of the couch hadn't been there before, I was almost certain of it. I set the photograph aside on the kitchen counter and tried to forget about it, focusing on sorting through other boxes. But I kept finding myself drawn back to it, and each time I looked, something was different. The curtains had been open, now they were closed. The clock on the mantel showed a different time. The expressions on the people's faces seemed to shift from neutral to increasingly distressed. By evening, I was genuinely frightened. I'd started taking photos of the photograph with my phone, trying to document the changes, but when I compared them, my phone photos showed the same thing every time, even though I could see with my own eyes that the physical photograph was different. It was as if the changes only existed when viewed directly, not through a camera lens. I called my mother to ask about the photograph, describing the people in it as best I could. She didn't recognize the description at first, but then I mentioned a distinctive brooch one of the women was wearing, and my mother went quiet. She said that sounded like her Aunt Margaret, my grandmother's sister who had died in that house in 1967 under circumstances the family never talked about. According to my mother, Margaret had been staying with my grandmother when she became convinced that something in the house was trying to communicate with her through reflections and photographs. She'd covered all the mirrors, destroyed most of the family photos, and eventually been found dead in the living room with no clear cause of death. The family had hushed it up, calling it a heart attack, but there had been rumors of something stranger. I looked at the photograph again, and this time Margaret was standing instead of sitting, her face turned toward the camera with an expression of absolute terror. The other people in the photo were looking at her now, their faces showing confusion and fear. The photograph was playing out some kind of scene, showing something that had happened in that room decades ago. I decided to leave the house for the night, staying in a motel in town. But I brought the photograph with me, unable to leave it behind for reasons I couldn't explain. In my motel room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, I watched as the scene in the photograph continued to unfold. Margaret was backing away from something outside the frame, the other people rising from their seats, hands reaching out either to help her or stop her. By morning, the photograph showed an empty room. All the people were gone, but there were shadows on the walls that suggested they were just outside the frame, and something dark was spreading across the floor like a stain. I drove back to my grandmother's house to compare the photograph to the actual living room, and what I found there made me pack everything I'd planned to keep and leave immediately. The living room looked exactly like the photograph now showed it, empty but wrong. And on the floor, in the exact spot where the dark stain appeared in the photo, there was a discoloration in the wood that had definitely not been there before. It was shaped vaguely like a person lying down, arms spread wide, and it was growing darker as I watched. I left the photograph in the house when I departed, placing it on the mantel where it seemed to belong. I told my mother I couldn't handle cleaning out the house alone and hired an estate sale company to deal with everything. They never mentioned finding anything unusual, and the house sold quickly to a young couple who seemed thrilled with their bargain. 6 months later, I saw a post on a paranormal forum from someone claiming their new house in rural Oregon had a photograph that changed every time they looked at it. They'd included a picture, and it was the same photograph, but now it showed their own living room with them sitting on a different couch, and in the corner, barely visible, was a shadow that might have been Margaret, still trying to warn people about something that happened in 1967. The backwards day. I woke up on a Thursday morning in my apartment in Chicago with the strangest feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a subtle wrongness like when you're coming down with the flu and everything feels slightly off. But as I went through my morning routine, I started noticing things that made no sense. The first clear sign was my phone. All my text conversations were backwards, with the newest messages at the top and the oldest at the bottom, the opposite of how they should be. But it wasn't just the order that was wrong. The conversations themselves seemed to be happening in reverse, with responses coming before questions, thank yous before favors, goodbyes before hellos. I assumed my phone was glitching and tried to ignore it, but then I turned on the news and watched in bewilderment as the anchor spoke in perfectly clear English while the words came out in reverse order. Not backwards like playing a recording in reverse, but constructed backwards, starting with the end of sentences and working toward the beginning. Morning, good news the with you join us she said with a bright smile. I thought I was having a stroke or some kind of neurological event, so I called in sick to work and made a doctor's appointment for that afternoon. But as I walked to the clinic, I realized the problem wasn't with me. People on the street were walking backwards, not awkwardly but naturally, as if that was the normal way to move. Cars drove in reverse down the streets, their drivers looking over their shoulders as they navigated perfectly through traffic. At the doctor's office, the receptionist greeted me by saying goodbye and asked me to leave before I'd even signed in. The whole interaction was backwards, ending with her welcoming me as I walked out the door, thoroughly confused. The doctor, when I finally saw him, examined me in reverse, starting by telling me I was healthy and ending by asking what brought me in. I tried to explain what I was experiencing, but my words came out in the wrong order too, starting with my conclusions and working back to my initial observations. The doctor nodded as if this made perfect sense and prescribed me medication by unprescribing it, taking a prescription pad that already had writing on it and erasing it word by word until it was blank. By the time I got home, I was convinced I was either dreaming or had entered some kind of parallel universe where causality worked differently. I sat in my apartment watching the sun set in the east and rise in the west, watching my neighbors leave for work at 5 p.m. and come home at 9 a.m., watching TV shows that started with credits and ended with opening scenes. The only thing that seemed to work normally was my thinking. Inside my head, 'Cause still preceded effect. Thoughts flowed in the right direction, and I could reason through what was happening even if I couldn't explain it. I spent hours trying to figure out if this was happening to everyone or just to me, if the world had always been this way and I just noticed, or if something had fundamentally changed overnight. I tried to sleep that night but found myself waking up before I'd fallen asleep, getting more energized as the night went on, feeling the tiredness drain away instead of accumulating. When morning came, or what should have been morning but felt like evening, I was wide awake and completely lost in this backwards world. The second day was when I started noticing other people who seemed as confused as I was. A woman at the coffee shop kept trying to order normally and getting frustrated when the barista handed her coffee before she'd asked for it. A man on the subway looked around wildly as the train went backwards through the tunnels, gripping the pole like he might fall through the floor. We found each other, those of us experiencing the world in the wrong direction. There were maybe a dozen of us in the city, and we met in a park, trying to communicate despite our words coming out backwards. We wrote messages to each other, but even those appeared on the page in reverse, the ink disappearing as we wrote, leaving blank pages that had somehow always been blank. On the third day things started to correct themselves, but not all at once. Time would flow normally for a few minutes, then reverse again, then stutter and jump. It was like reality was trying to find its proper direction but kept overcorrecting. People walked forward for a few steps, then backwards, then sideways in ways that shouldn't have been possible. By the fourth day, I woke up on Thursday morning again, the same Thursday I'd started on, but this time everything was flowing in the right direction. My phone showed conversations that made sense, the news anchor spoke normally, and people walked forward like they were supposed to. But I retained all my memories of the backwards days, as did the others I'd met in the park. We still meet sometimes, comparing notes, trying to understand what happened. The general consensus is that we experienced some kind of temporal anomaly, a bubble where cause and effect got reversed, but none of us can explain why we were aware of it while most people weren't. Some think we're special somehow, chosen to witness this glitch in reality. Others think we're cursed, marked by our awareness of how fragile the normal flow of time really is. I never found out what caused those backwards days or whether they'll happen again. But I live differently now, always aware that tomorrow might flow into yesterday, that effect might precede cause, that the world might suddenly reverse itself without warning. It's made me appreciate the simple forward flow of time in a way most people never think about, and it's left me with the unsettling knowledge that reality is far more malleable than we like to believe. The room that wasn't there. My wife Sarah and I bought our first house in the suburbs of Portland, a 1920s craftsman that needed work but had good bones and was within our budget. We spent the first month painting, replacing fixtures, making it ours, getting familiar with every corner of our new home. Which is why what happened next was so impossible to explain. I was working from home on a Tuesday when I noticed a door I'd never seen before. It was in the hallway between our bedroom and the guest room, a perfectly normal-looking door that matched the others in the house, with the same vintage glass doorknob and the same painted trim. But it absolutely had not been there when we'd moved in, had not been there that morning when I'd walked past that spot to get coffee. I stood in the hallway staring at it, trying to rationalize its appearance. Maybe we'd somehow overlooked it, though that seemed impossible given how thoroughly we'd explored the house. Maybe it had been hidden behind something, though the hallway had always been empty. Maybe I was having some kind of mental break, though everything else seemed completely normal. I called Sarah at work and tried to explain, but she thought I was joking. We didn't have a door there, she insisted. She'd walked through that hallway 1,000 times. I sent her a photo and she called back immediately, her voice shaking. In her memory, in the photos on her phone from when we'd first viewed the house, there was no door. But she was looking at my photo and there it clearly was. We decided not to open it until she got home, but curiosity got the better of me after an hour of trying to work while that impossible door sat there in our hallway. I turned the handle, expecting resistance or for it to be locked, but it opened smoothly, revealing a room that couldn't exist. The room was furnished like it belonged in our house, with the same hardwood floors and crown molding, but decorated in a style from the 1960s. There was a single bed with a yellow chenille bedspread, a small desk with homework spread across it, posters on the walls for bands I'd never heard of, and afternoon sunlight streaming through a window that should have been facing our neighbor's wall but instead showed a yard I didn't recognize. I stepped inside and the air felt different, thicker somehow, with a smell of old paper and something floral I couldn't identify. The homework on the desk was dated April 15, 1963, math problems in a child's handwriting, the name Timothy Chin written carefully at the top. The posters advertised concerts at venues I knew had been demolished decades ago, featuring bands that might have existed but that I'd never encountered. When I looked out the window, I saw our neighborhood but wrong. The houses were different colors, some were missing entirely, replaced by empty lots or different structures. There were cars in driveways that looked period appropriate, and in the distance I could see downtown Portland's skyline but lower, missing all the modern buildings like I was looking at the city from 50 years ago. I backed out of the room quickly, closing the door, my heart racing. When Sarah got home, we opened it together, but the room had changed. Now it was decorated like a 1980s teenager's room, with different posters, a different bedspread, different homework on the desk dated October 2nd, 1987, this time with the name Jennifer Watts at the top. We started documenting everything, taking photos, videos, making notes. Every time we opened the door, the room was different, always a teenager's bedroom but from different eras, with different names on the homework, different views out the impossible window. Sometimes it was from the future, showing dates from 2034 or 2041, with technology we didn't recognize and homework for subjects that didn't exist yet. We researched every name we found, and that's when things got truly unsettling. Timothy Chin had lived in our house in 1963 but had disappeared without a trace at age 15. Jennifer Watts had lived here in 1987 and had also vanished at 15. Every name we found connected to the room belonged to a teenager who had lived in our house and disappeared, their cases never solved. The pattern held even for the future dates. We couldn't find those people yet, obviously, but we found their families. The Johnsons, who would apparently live in our house in 2034, had a 12-year-old son named Marcus. The Parks, who would move in around 2040, had a 13-year-old daughter named Emma. These kids were alive now, just younger, living in other cities, not yet teenagers, not yet missing. We contacted a physics professor at Portland State, showed him our documentation, and watched his worldview crumble as he tried to explain the impossible. He brought colleagues, and soon our house was full of scientists taking measurements, setting up equipment, trying to understand how a room could exist that showed different time periods but the same space. The consensus, if you could call it that, was that the room was some kind of temporal anomaly, a space where multiple timelines overlapped. The teenagers' bedrooms all existed in the same location but at different times, and somehow they were all accessible through our door. But that didn't explain why only teenagers' rooms appeared, or why all those teenagers had disappeared. Then one night, we opened the door to find the room occupied. A teenage boy sat at the desk doing homework, and when we gasped, he looked up at us with confusion that turned to terror. He could see us, we could see him, and for a moment we existed in the same space across decades. He asked who we were, what we were doing in his house, and before we could answer, he vanished, leaving only the empty room from 1974. We found his missing person report the next day. David Turner, age 15, disappeared from his bedroom on March 18, 1974, no signs of struggle, no explanation. His parents had insisted someone had taken him, that he'd never run away, but police found no evidence of intruders. Now we knew what had happened. He'd seen us, or someone like us, through a door that shouldn't exist, and somehow that interaction had pulled him out of his timeline. We sealed the door after that, nailing it shut, covering it with drywall, painting over it. But sometimes, late at night, we can hear sounds from behind the wall. Footsteps pacing, desk drawers opening and closing, the scratch of pencil on paper. The room is still there, still cycling through time, still showing the bedrooms of teenagers who disappeared. We've decided to move, to let someone else deal with the impossible door, but we've also made a decision not to warn the next owners. If they never notice the door, never open it, maybe it will stay hidden. Maybe no more teenagers will disappear. Or maybe the door will reveal itself again, and someone else will have to grapple with the knowledge that time isn't as linear as we thought, and that sometimes people slip through cracks between moments, lost in spaces that exist outside the normal flow of history. We've kept track of Marcus Johnson and Emma Park, the future missing teenagers. They're growing up normally in their respective cities, no idea that someday they'll live in our house, no idea that their rooms already exist behind a door we've hidden. We've debated warning their families, but what would we say? How could we explain? And would trying to prevent their future disappearances cause them instead? The house is on the market now, priced to sell quickly. We've moved to a modern apartment building where all the doors lead exactly where they should, where time flows in one direction, where teenagers' bedrooms stay in their proper decades. But I still dream about that room, about all those missing kids existing simultaneously in the same space, and I wonder if somewhere, in some timeline, they're all still there, doing homework forever in a room that exists outside of time.